So it seems it's a Tyranid victory at the Battle of Oghram today, and we've got an absolutely enormous amount of kit reveals for the Tyranids, new Gaunts, new Genestealers, new artillery, a sinister new Neurolictor, and the massive enormous alpha level threat that is the Norn Emissary. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking through all the new Tyranid reveals, some really quite exciting stuff for the swarms here, all of which is going to be coming out alongside the new Tyranids Codex. Let's talk about the victory from the Battle of Oghram, all the new kits including some new ones to the range, plus some surprises for the old ones. We've got Gaunts with special weapons as you can see on the bottom left, and a whole bunch more fun exciting stuff besides. So it does indeed seem that the Tyranids have won that Battle for Oghram campaign that Games Workshop was running. This one was the one where you had Leviathan box codes, you submitted them online, and then in theory after you played your first game of Tyranids vs Space Marines in 10th edition, you'd submit which army had won, though it does sound like quite a lot of people were just using it as votes for what they wanted to see first. According to GW, they had 44,000 votes, and compared with quite a lot of global campaigns, this one tended to be closer than normal. They did do a couple of progress reports, but now it looks like the Tyranids just nosed ahead a little bit, 53% to 47%. To be honest, I'm not too surprised it was at least fairly close. I feel like there's more Space Marine players out there, and within the Leviathan box itself, it looks like the Marines do have the upper hand if you were just literally playing with two sides of that same box, as it's not enormously well balanced. But then we've had a whole ton of Space Marine releases over the past few years, not really that much for the Tyranids, bar the Leviathan box, so I'm not too surprised that more of the community in general was keen to see new Tyranids, as opposed to yet more Primaris Marines. In any case, I'd say that this preview definitely lived up to the hype, a massive new range for the Tyranids with a whole ton of plastic kits. They basically did resculpts for all of the things that I was expecting them to: Genestealers, Hormagaunts, Termagants, the Lictor, and the Biovore and Pyrovore. Plus we've also had a couple of other interesting things, the new Deathleaper that we'd seen already, but also a new Neurolictor, halfway between a Lictor and a Zoanthrope it would seem, and then perhaps the kit that a lot of people were most interested to see, the Norn Emissary that can also be built as a Norn Assimilator, basically a big Tyranid alpha level predator. It turns out maybe not quite on the same level as something like an Imperial Knight, but still absolutely enormous, maybe kind of similar to a Tyrannifex in weight class perhaps. They also confirmed that Codex Tyranids will be the first one out in 10th edition at sometime in autumn by their previous release schedule, and there will be a whole bunch of Space Marine goodness on the way, but they have stuck true to their word and not done that all today. I guess they'll have a similar reveal show for them probably in the next month or so. Will be interesting to see what the Space Marines get. Let's jump into it though and go through the new kits one by one. First up, we have a rather nice new resculpt for the Genestealers. They're going to be coming in boxes of 10 now as opposed to boxes of 8. I think that's quite a nice thing for the kit. Definitely a kit that I think has needed a resculpt for around about a decade or so now. I'm kind of surprised that they hadn't released one before now. I was kind of wondering if there might wind up being a kill team kit for these. Looks like initially that's not going to be the case. I suppose it's not impossible. They could release a kill team style kit with a bunch of upgrades for them. That could be kind of interesting for the future maybe. As with a lot of the new Tyranids, I feel like these guys look a lot more dynamic, with a lot more motion captured by the miniatures, as opposed to them sort of running in a similar sort of pose towards the enemy in a fairly uniform way. Though the general overall look and feel of these guys is pretty similar to what it was, I don't think they'd want to mess with the iconic Genestealer design quite so much. They did give us another couple of views of the kit as well. Apparently there's going to be enough to equip the squad with these Imgar style feeder tendril heads that you can see on the left here, this one modelling the more classic Genestealer cult type colour scheme. Though currently both for the Genestealer cult and the Genestealers from the Tyranid army, any changes to their armament and things are kind of aesthetic and they just have the one datasheet without any real major in-game options. There's quite a nice close-up of them painted up in a Kraken colour scheme on the right as well. Looks quite cool with them all jumping down from terrain there, and one guy modelling those stylish feeder tendrils. At least at the moment they seem to be fairly usable in game, scout organisms that can deal a big punch to enemy units on objectives, and are at least a little bit tougher than they used to be with 2 wounds rather than 1. Looks like they have been able to creep their way into a couple of competitive lists, as we'll talk about in a video in the next day or two. Another classic miniature with a resculpt with a Hormagaunts, again one that absolutely needed an update if they were going to redo the Tyranid line in a major way. Again, like the Termagants, these guys were just quite an old sculpt. While the individual miniatures I thought held up better than the Termagants perhaps, they did have a bit of an issue in that they were really off balance and could often just fall over in game quite a lot. And again, maybe not quite as varied or organic in terms of posing compared with what they can be now. I do really quite like the variety on these guys, has some of them just running towards the enemy, some of them jumping or preparing to jump, doing that iconic leaping move into battle. Looks like this kit also comes with a Ripper Swarm now as well. I don't believe that they did in the past. So there'd be another kit that could allow you to build up towards 4 squads of Rippers if you wanted some. And it does indeed look like they come in a squad of 10 now, as opposed to the squads of 12 that they had from ages past. In game at the moment, I'd say they're usable enough as swarms. They do move very, very quickly and have got quite big high objective control numbers. In general, not the biggest threats to most things bar lighter infantry though, with only a flurry of strength 3 attacks. Still though, a 10-inch move and advance and charge is pretty nice. You can throw them onto the midfield objectives and just gum up the enemy and skirmish with their lighter troops. Here's another slightly better view of the new miniatures. I do quite like the variety of poses and they look very, very dynamic, hurtling towards you in game. Hopefully they have thought a bit more about the centre of gravity of these ones now, though to be honest I'd be kind of surprised if it was worse than before. Next up, and in a similar vein, we've got the Termagants, these guys releasing individually as well as from the Leviathan box. It looks like they're the only kit from the Leviathan box that are getting a big full multi-part plastic kit, though I'm maybe not too surprised at that. A lot of the rest of them just seem like they are just basically what they are and wouldn't need to change too much, whereas the Termagants quite clearly needed their other war gear options adding in, as opposed to just flesh borers. According to the stream, they said that they come with the options of spine fists, devourers, or flesh borers. I feel like a lot of people run them with flesh borers as they're what's the most easily available. I feel like the devourers and the spine fists do actually compete pretty well in terms of a rules perspective. But perhaps the most surprising thing about the new Termagants kit is that we've actually got special weapons in there. Looks like they come with a shard launcher, strangleweb launcher, and spike rifle. So it seems like the average Tyranid rank and file might just have a little bit more threat, and perhaps be a bit more capable of tangling with enemy elites. The shard launcher looks very similar to the bio cannon carried by the Biovores, so I guess that's probably going to be a blast anti-infantry type weapon. The strangleweb launcher, I'd guess, might be the equivalent of a Tyranid flamer type thing. I wouldn't be too surprised if that had just had a very similar profile to a standard flamer with strength 4 and torrent. Could be similar to the strangleweb cannons and have blast though, I suppose. And then the spike rifle looks like it might be a bit more of an anti-elite shot. I can't imagine that thing being something for taking down tanks, but I wouldn't be too surprised if it had mid-strength and some AP, maybe damage too if it's lucky. I perhaps can't help but think that this might be a bit of a crafty upsell on the new Termagants, seeing as if they're going to have the same points cost as the standard ones that come in Leviathan, then you wouldn't have access to these special weapons, but presumably in the new codex they're going to be free and rolled into the datasheet. Means that in theory that if you've got Termagants at the moment, they're going to be a bit suboptimal compared with having a bunch of random specials in, though they might not make the biggest difference in the world compared with just their role of holding objectives and things. I guess if you've got swarms of gaunts already, you could probably just convert a couple to pretty much look the part. I guess cannibalising some barb gaunts to make those shard launcher things could be quite good there. It's perhaps one of the disadvantages of the Games Workshop's point system, in that the basic equipped troops are never going to be optimal if they've got the options to take some special weapons, which it looks like the Termagants have just acquired. In any case though, I do think that the new guns are kind of cool. Some of them hark back to older Tyranid designs from a long time ago. Looks like a Ripper base still comes in the multi-part plastic kit as well, that was pictured in the previous image. And here you can see all the squad in all its sinister boggy glory. They did mention on the stream that the strangleweb thing feeds into the back of the gaunt and is sort of parasiting off it. Again, some very nice Tyranid weirdness there. You don't just need a power pack for your gun, you can basically just power it yourself with your own life force. Next up, we had another very, very likely one indeed with the Lictor. I think this guy was almost guaranteed to get a resculpt in a new Tyranid line, one of the more iconic Tyranid organisms, and stuck with a fine cast kit. And then they'd made Von Ryan's Leapers, so mini Lictors, and already shown us the new updated Deathleaper sculpt. I think it would have been a very strange decision indeed to remake both of those things and not do the standard Lictor again. I think it's a pretty fitting upgrade on the previous one. Definitely looking a lot more sharp and dangerous, I think. The feeder tendrils look very sinister, though it has basically kept pretty much the same appearance as the last one. In game again, they seem to be fairly popular Tyranid organisms in army lists right now. They can start in the midfield and have all sorts of advantages to give them the first strike on the enemy. Fights first if they get charged, stealth to keep them safe against shooting a bit, invulnerable saves, precision attacks, and lone operative, and just their standard combat profile is fairly good at killing enemy elites. They also showed one off with an alternative pose as well, a bit more of a hunched over one painted in a behemoth colour scheme. Quite cool to see that the kit's got some flexibility, and you don't need to have all the Lictors look just in exactly the same way if you don't want to. One of the biggest surprises that we're not seeing yet for the Tyranids is this Neurolictor. This one's basically a Tyranid infiltration guy, but basically half a zone throat thrown in as well. And apparently he does standard Lictor things, but with also a bit of a mind control, battle shock, and manipulation type scheme going on. In the stream they were talking about it having abilities where the enemy units got further debuffs if they failed battle shock, and even mentioned doing things like turning their guns on their own comrades. though I feel like that might be a little bit unlikely to be realised in 10th edition, though I guess we'll wait and see. Apparently he can also fight fairly hard, though I'd guess it's probably not going to be as much of a combat threat as a standard Lictor, otherwise there wouldn't be much point for the standard one. But overall I think they've done really quite nicely with the model, really quite a cool fusion of Lictor and Zoanthrope, and looks thoroughly creepy and not what you want to meet in a dark alley. Compared with the other Lictors, it seems to be slithering along on a disturbing tail there, as well as its legs. Really quite a cool creature, that one. Some of the slender limbs and things remind me a bit of the Parasite and Mortrex as well. Seems like it's got similar sort of vibes going on to some extent, being a bit more of an infiltration and disruption type organism. Then they also mentioned Deathleaper as well. This guy we'd already seen the miniature for, with his sort of caped Tyranid assassin type appearance. Generally quite positively received after the new NIDs, and looks like a kit that a fair few people are looking forward to pick up. They didn't say on stream whether it was dual build from the same Lictor kit or not. I'm genuinely unsure which way they could go with that. The posing looks at least fairly similar between the claws and things on the top of him. The legs and terrain that it's standing on look a bit different though. I think my first guess would be that it'll probably be a completely separate kit, though it's not impossible he could be dual build. They actually gave us the name of something called a Vanguard Assault Detachment as well, something they had previously mentioned for Tyranids going forward. That's going to be one of the new detachments in the Tyranids Codex, one that basically excels around Tyranid infiltration and scouting type organisms, such as the Lictors themselves. In the free text in one of their articles, they said that it will feature around a lot of tricks for outflanking your opponent and getting the first strike. I guess that might be mainly realised among things like getting new stratagems to support Lictors and things moving into the midfield, maybe. In any case, currently he's really quite strong in game as well, slightly harder to kill than a standard Lictor, and a useful enough battle shock debuff with -1 leadership going on. Maybe one of the more useful battle shock penalties as they go. Next up, and one of the bigger redesigns for the Tyranids, are the new Biovore and Pyrovore kits. I feel like a lot of the time when they redesign kits in Warhammer 40k, they tend to keep a fairly similar sort of aesthetic, but they do seem to have really quite departed from that with the Biovore and the Pyrovore. And rather than going for the more lumbering beast type vibe, they seem to have gone for something far more insectoid this time round. This one's now a bit of a six-limbed, rather armoured bug with a bit of a turret symbiotic bioweapon on the back. Though according to them it's still going to be fulfilling pretty much the same role in the army, it fires out of line of sight as it did before, and also spawns spore mines as well. Again, the Biovores and Pyrovores I thought were a kit that absolutely did need updating, ludicrously expensive for what you got, and not the best quality miniature in the world if you got one. I guess I was expecting them to do something more or less along the same lines as they've done for many of the other things like the Lictors and the Hormagaunts and things though. They really have done this to quite a different aesthetic. I think overall though it does look kind of cool. Will be interesting to see if the Biovore's new body comes with any changes to the stat line or anything. It maybe looks a little bit bigger and sturdier, though I guess it's kind of hard to judge the scale just from this miniature here. I wouldn't be too surprised to see a few more wounds on it and maybe a better save though with that appearance. As mentioned, there is the alternative build for the Pyrovore as well. This one's the Tyranid Chemical Flamer Beast basically. At the moment they're really quite cheap individual units that just spout out a whole torrent of burning acid, pre-digesting the enemies for consumption by the swarm. The gun on this one does look really quite similar to the standard Biovore one I think, just seems to have a few more big chemical like biological tanks going on there. And both of these look like they are just coming in individual units still. I wonder whether or not there'll still be the option to squadron them in squads of 3, or whether they might just be fielded more individually. They do at least look a little bit bigger and chunkier. Finally, we've got the two biggest baddest Tyranids of the lot, the Norn Emissary and the Norn Assimilator, two really big Tyranids that you can make as a dual build. The Emissary, at least, we did know that this was coming. There was that lore about the one on the World of Sanctum that fought and was killed by Trajan Valoris. Basically enormous Tyranid organisms that are created with one specific task in mind. Often the Emissary is sent to perhaps capture enemy commanders and devour their knowledge for the hive mind, eliminating a great threat and devouring their knowledge for future battles. The Emissary is a psychic beast. That one's got a whole bunch of those Zoanthrope type brains on the back of his carapace there, and apparently it's got really quite a lot of ranged psychic damage, as well as being a fairly potent melee threat, as you'd guess. And I feel like it's really quite a cool kit in general. I've got a feel of a monstrous size hive tyrant pretty much. It looks really quite big and agile as well, maybe just some very slight hints of things like that previous Tyranid Dimacharon perhaps. Apparently these are going to be some of the biggest Tyranid plastic beasties that we've seen so far, perhaps not quite on the same sort of scale as an Imperial Knight, but not an enormous way off. Seems like this guy might be in the same sort of weight class as a Tyrannofex perhaps, but a bit more upright in stance as opposed to being a bit more of a lumbering beast. Looks like really quite a cool kit there. He's got a whole load of Tyranid terrain on his base. It looks like he's fighting with some rather creepy rending claws and talons, as well as his psychic might, it would seem. We do have a couple more pictures of him as well. Those carapace spines are really quite big compared with a lot of Tyranids. That looks like it's going to be one of the dominating features of the model. And it's got a whole bunch of tentacles coming out of the back of those brain type things. Definitely looks like he could be a pretty imposing centerpiece. I expect it's going to be at least fairly expensive to buy as well. The dual build option for him is the Norn Assimilator. I kind of feel like the name's a bit weird for this one. Apparently the lore for this guy is that he's more just of a brute force threat, maybe more in keeping with a big Carnifex type thing that's just spawned to take down one enormous enemy threat in their army, whether it's something like a powerful fortification or a really big battle tank or enemy monster. Apparently his primary scary weapon are the toxin injector harpoons that you can see on his lower set of limbs there. They can spike the enemy and draw them to him. And it looks like he's got a whole bunch of flesh hook type things on his carapace as well to hold them in place once he's got them. They said that these things are going to have some sort of option for being better at taking one specific point on the battlefield or taking down one big enemy monster or threat. I kind of wonder if it might be one of those rules that means that you nominate one objective or one monster or vehicle or something before the game and they get a massive damage buff against them. I'm sure they're going to be at least fairly effective against most targets though. This one does appear to be missing the psychic brain type things. Looks like he's not a psyker and is just more about brute melee force. Finally, and just for some scale, here's the Assimilator painted up in some Kraken colours going to toe against an enemy Wraith Lord. Seems it is very decently bigger compared with most standard monsters and walkers, but I'd still say not quite Titanic Knight scale perhaps. Definitely a Tyranid organism on the upper end of the weight class though. I feel like they're going to be really quite popular. A massive great big Tyranid aggressive organism like this looks like they'd be fun to play with. Hopefully their rules are suitably brutal in game. Overall, really quite a massive amount of new stuff there. I think they've done well with all these fancy new Tyranid organisms. Let me know which ones you think are best down in the comments below, and which ones you'd be most tempted to get your hands on. Looks like they'll be releasing in autumn alongside the Tyranid Codex, so a bit of time to wait yet still, but good to know that the bugs have got some really quite cool stuff on the way. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day, and I'm sure Games Workshop will keep the news coming with plenty more to talk about. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's the main way that I can keep on making videos like this quite so regularly. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.